All right. Welcome to Unit 5. I'm going to take you through, give you the lecture on Unit 5, the end of the Gilded Age. We're going to be talking about the rise of a labor movement against big business. If you remember back, one of the earlier lectures was about how the Gilded Age, the government kept its hands off of business, and businesses grew, and we became the #1 economy in the world. But at the same time, businesses were becoming too powerful and they weren't paying their workers very much. So we have a new movement called labor unions are going to be created. And we're going to look at the impact of big business on these workers and unions, and how's the government going to respond. It's going to respond in various ways towards the workers and towards big business during this time period. So lecture 3 was all about industrialization and urbanization in the United States. In lecture 2, we talked about new immigrants coming into the United States, and they had very little skills and very little money, and they're willing to work in very low paying, dangerous conditions for very long hours inside of America's large manufacturing industries. And it's not going to be safe, and women and children will be working as well. There's mandatory schools not in effect yet, so many children are working in unsafe conditions. And so what workers are going to start doing is they're going to organize into unions, and they're going to go on strikes against big business. And at first the government's going to side with big business, but eventually the government will begin passing laws to prevent the formation of large monopolies. Let's look at all the vocab we need to know for this unit. Let's start with trust and monopoly. So the trust and monopolies are the causes of a lot of problems in American society. And what are they? A trust is a monopoly or cartel that enters into agreements with other businesses to control a product or an industry. So trust and monopolies are just very powerful businesses that can control vast areas of America's economy. So remember when we talked about John D. Rockefeller and how Rockefeller was able to create a large oil empire under Standard Oil, and he controlled 90% of the oil market. That's a monopoly. And that's a result of the government's kind of laissez-faire, hands-off approach to letting the United States economy grow. So as a result, a lot of workers are going to feel that they're getting taken advantage of. There's no protections for them, compensations if they're hurt or killed on the job. They're very low-paying work in a lot of these industrial centers in the United States. So they're going to form into collective groups called labor unions. And I really like this political cartoon here because we can kind of see what a labor union is. It's a collection of workers who have united, and united they are stronger in fighting for what they want, and they want to be paid better, and they don't want to work long hours all day. They want shorter hours, and they want safe working conditions, which weren't really being provided for them during the late 19th century, the 1880s, 1890s. And one of the ways that they got the attention of these large industries is they're going to go on something called strike. It's a tactic used where workers refuse to work, and they're going to disrupt the business that they're working for. They'll stand outside, they'll give speeches, and they'll prevent anybody from entering the factory or work compound. And it's an attempt to get the management of businesses to negotiate with them. And this is the mid 1880s, 1881 to 1885, there were 500 strikes a year involving 150,000 American workers. And 1886 is considered the year of the great uprising of America's workforce, America's labor force. Who are the labor leaders that we need to know? Well, we need to know a gentleman named Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs was a very prominent labor leader in the 1880s, and he's going to form the American Railway Union to help railroad workers. And he's going to lead a series of strikes. We'll look at some of those strikes in a few slides, and he'll end up becoming a very prominent spokesman for the American worker. And he's going to go to jail several times for his role in protesting industry's treatment and the government's treatment of the American worker. And then we have Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers was a labor leader, definitely didn't support the strikes that Eugene Debs used to get the attention of management and to protect American workers. He founds the American Federation of Labor, and he's going to use something called collective bargaining to increase pay and lower working hours with management. That's, the workers and management would negotiate to increase pay and prevent dangerous working conditions without having to go on strike. So Samuel Gompers is very a prominent leader. He promoted harmony among various labor groups, and he also was a big supporter of taking political action, electing people into office that supported various labor unions and labor groups. Okay, what are the big important, we're talking a lot about strikes and labor unrest. What are the big important events we need to know? Well, one of the biggest strikes in American history was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It's also sometimes referred to as the Great Upheaval. And it began in West Virginia, but it was a railroad strike that spread across a lot of the Northeast, and it involved railroad workers getting their wages cut. So they went on strike. And the big thing about the Great Railroad Strike is various militia groups, National Guard troops, and federal troops are used to break up the strikes and restore order in order to get America's railroads running again. And the strike also kind of turns the government against various working groups, as the government's going to side mostly with these large business groups and railroads during the Gilded Age when it involves strikes. And a lot of cities are going to start establishing National Guard armories to prevent future strikes. Another big important strike for you to know is the Pullman strike. And this is a railroad strike led by Eugene Debs. And Pullman was a very wealthy industrialist who had made his fortune building like first class railroad cars. They were called sleeper cars, very comfortable, luxurious way to travel the railroads. And he built a company town, and he made all of his workers live in this company town. And they had to pay rent to him and use his company store. And what happens is Pullman decides to start cutting their wages. And this is also kind of during a great economic depression. So this is 1893, 1894. And so the workers' wages are cut by Pullman, but their rent stays the same. So Eugene Debs leads a very violent strike against the Pullman Pals Car Company. And it gets violent because the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, feels that the railroad strike is stopping mail cars from moving along the rail lines. And so the federal troops are brought in to break up the strike, and it ends very violently. 30 people were killed, and Eugene Debs ends up going to prison over this. And he's going to be defended by somebody very important that we're going to talk about in the 1920s. He's going to be defended by an attorney named Clarence Darrow. All right, let's go to the next event, the Haymarket Square bombing. Here's the Great Railroad Strike, images of the Great Railroad Strike. See very violent protests. So the Haymarket riot was a gathering in Haymarket Square, which is in Chicago, and workers were gathering to speak out against police brutality. Previously, some workers had been killed by the police, and so they're gathering to give speeches, and they want better working conditions, and they want an 8-hour workday. And so what happens is the police arrive at this gathering, and somebody throws, you can see in this illustration here, somebody throws a bomb at the police, and unfortunately kills 7 police officers. And a whole bunch of 8 people were arrested. They were called anarchists, people that want to kind of get rid of the government. They want no government controls. And anarchy, the fear of anarchists kind of comes out of the new immigrants coming to the United States. Americans were afraid that among some of these immigrant groups were radicals who wanted to destabilize the American system and the American government. Anyways, the bomb kills these policemen, and some of the anarchists end up getting executed by the so let's go on to our last one, is the Coal Creek labor saga, which is in Tennessee. And this actually involves something that was unique mostly to the American South. A lot of companies, especially coal mining companies, hired prisoners from the state governments to do a lot of the coal mining, so they wouldn't have to pay them. And this upset a lot of coal miners in Coal Creek, which is in East Tennessee. And so they quit, they leave their jobs, and they end up attacking this coal mine and destroying the prison housing. And the state Tennessee militia shows up, and they end up kind of in this guerrilla war against the coal miners. And the end result of this unrest is that the state kind of re-examines the use of convict labor, which was very prominent in the Gilded Age. And we're going to kind of start seeing states ending this practice of sending prisoners into these coal mines. But it is just another example of the general unrest of the Gilded Age, and how the government typically supported these industries against the workers. These are some of the telegrams deploying troops, the governor deploying the troops to put down the Coal Creek labor saga. And here's Pullman, a political cartoon protesting how Pullman's treating the workers. Low wages, high rent, squeezing the worker. Whatever money the worker does have out of his clothing here. So there's all of this unrest and violence in the United States. The federal government will eventually kind of re-examine the power of large industries and trusts in the country. So we have the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was designed to prohibit these trusts from forming and controlling, having large control over products or industry. And it was a kind of a first step for the federal government to kind of approach the relationship between labor unions and large industries. And you can see here the word antitrust kind of start outlawing some of these monopolistic business practices. And it will be used eventually by presidents, particularly Theodore Roosevelt and some of the other progressive presidents, to go after powerful railroad trusts and eventually Standard Oil. And then along comes another antitrust act, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which upholds the rights of labor unions. So now we kind of see the government's going to start taking the side, a little bit more of the side of the worker And this is like kind of a result of something called the progressive age, which we're going to start talking about here in a couple of lectures. And it's going to target price fixing, further target price fixing and monopolies in America's industries. Got this little cartoon. People try to start restricting the large capital. All right, chronology. We're still in 1877, which is the year that Reconstruction ends. Remember the Compromise of 1877, which ended Reconstruction in the United States. It ended Reconstruction in the South. That's also the same year as the Great Railroad Strike. So we have a lot of turmoil in 1876, 1877, political turmoil, social turmoil, labor turmoil. 1886 is the Haymarket Square bombings. That's also the year that Gompers forms the American Federation of Labor. 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act. 1891 is the Coal Creek labor conflict. The Pullman strikes in 1894. And all the way in 1914 is the Clayton Antitrust Act is passed. So there's our timeline. It kind of sits on top of the previous three timelines. So I really just want you to see the dynamic complexities of the Gilded Age. There's so much happening because remember we also talked about all these inventions, the widespread the use of new technologies, industrialization of the United States. We talked about how the South was changing with segregation and Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Western movement of Americans, and this widespread construction of railroads. So we still have a lot of continuity. We're talking a lot about industrialization. Remember, industry, factories, the power of railroads, and Americans migrating or immigrating into America's cities, with a focus in the Northeast. What's changing? Workers are going to start forming unions, and we're going to have a big, huge conflict between business and labor. And we're going to start having some antitrust laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. And this will kind of spur the end of the laissez-faire approach that the government has towards allowing the American economy to grow. We're going to start seeing more regulation and more oversight, especially in the upcoming lectures when we start focusing in on progressivism and progressive reform. So that is Unit 5.